The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aubrey McLaughlin. I am the Associate Director of Events and Professional Programs for the University of Maryland Alumni Association. We're excited you're able to join us for today's webinar, How Women Rise, Breaking the Habits That Are Holding You Back, presented by Sarah Michelle Lazarus and Michael Seelman. This webinar is part of the Alumni Association's Professional Development webinar series, in which we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve your personal and professional goals. We have a lot of information to cover today, but we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to submit any questions that you have using the question box that's located in the GoToWebinar control panel. A recording and slides from today's webinar will also be available and will be shared following today's session. So now I'd like to introduce both of our hosts for today. Sarah Michelle Lazarus leads a computer security incident response team as a senior manager at Salesforce. Prior to joining Salesforce, Sarah built a 24/7/365 security operations center at Defense Point Security, where she led a team protecting client networks. She is a rising leader with 12 years of experience in the information technology field. Sarah previously served as an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, teaching a course called Cyberforce Superiority, Foundational Elements, with the goal of empowering graduate students to create better policy through application of technical cybersecurity knowledge. Sarah is also a graduate of the University of Maryland. As an undergraduate, she studied as a fellow at the James McGregor Academy of Leadership and also earned a citation in entrepreneurship through the Hyman CEOs program. We also have a host, Michael Seelman, who is the principal consultant and coach for Churchill Consultants, an international coaching, consulting, and inspirational speaking firm. Previously, he served in leadership positions at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the White House, including roles in communications, employee engagement, intergovernmental liaison, knowledge management, innovation, leadership development, information security, and high-profile multi-city collaborative violence reduction initiatives. Michael also did his undergraduate theses and collaborated on a book with leadership scholar and Pulitzer Prize-winning author James McGregor Burns at the University of Maryland. He received his master's degree in public administration from Harvard University, where he did his master's thesis with leadership scholar Ronald Heifetz. Is that correct, Michael? Am I saying that right?
Got it.
Awesome.
You got it.
Perfect. And now we'll get started. Sarah Michelle and Michael, take it away.
Aubrey, thank you so much for that introduction. Sarah, Michelle, and I are very excited to be with all of you today. And we wanted to kind of frame things as we jump into the presentation. And we were really influenced by a Harvard Business Review article that Sarah Michelle found about feedback and building on strengths. So we wanted to share some of that knowledge we gained from that article. So we suggest that when you think about this presentation, start by recognizing your great strengths, your values and practices that got you to your current level of success. So we want to acknowledge that and appreciate that. Then we hope that during this presentation, you will think about how to focus these strengths, values, and practices in new ways that will allow you to rise to the roles of even greater impact and service to your company, to your community, and to your family. If you do that, our country will be a better place for it. This presentation will focus on 12 habits that are more likely exhibited by women than men, but we recognize that not all women and men are the same. So it could apply to you, it may not. And so we just want to acknowledge that in the beginning. And we were just talking with Aubrey, and some of the habits resonate with her and others don't resonate with her as much. So we expect the same will be true of you as well. Some of these habits that you have may be founded in values such as modesty, willingness to work hard, to master skills, loyalty, desire to make other people happy, and putting focus on others' needs. And these are all commendable values. we invite you to explore whether these habits, if some of these habits that we discussed resonate with you, to see if, as part of your own experience, you might want to let go of some of these past behaviors that are no longer serving you and try new ones that might help you receive the results that you desire, while still maintaining those underlying values that are so important to you. And some of those values may have engendered those habits, but they may not be serving you anymore as you try to rise in your organization or in the community that you serve. As we describe these habits, we will check in with you to see if they resonate with you, and Aubrey will be helping us with a poll to test that resonance. And we'll also suggest ways of letting go of those habits that you might identify with. And then we're going to ask you at the end to make a commitment to further this exploration or to commit to no longer pursue habits that aren't serving you. And we'll ask at the question and answer period what questions you might have and if there's any commitment that you might want to make. So as we go through this presentation, please give a mind to that, of what you might want to commit to, using this opportunity to start a new day in your life or a new chapter. And we recognize that this is a personal journey that you are going through and that we're going through. And so we wanted to start by sharing our own story, our own personal journey of how Sarah, Michelle, and I came to team up and things that we have in common. So Sarah, Michelle, please take it away.
Great. So we'll move on to the next slide, which shares my goals and my journey together. So we both graduated from the University of Maryland in College Park, and we're both students at the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership, although at slightly different times. Served in government agencies and in tech roles, then came together at the Academy of Leadership's launch at the University of Cambridge in the UK. We started off conducting original research into leading humans and machines, artificial intelligence teams, and we presented at a Leadership Association conference last fall. And we thought it'd be fun to continue our presenting and give this talk on women's leadership. We are also dedicating this presentation to a woman who mentored us, brought us together, and inspires us to reach our full potential. Leadership scholar, Dr. Georgia Sorensen.
Hey, thank you, Sarah Michelle. And so this next slide, what we wanted to talk about was the book, How Women Rise. And that's what we're basing the content of the presentation on. And there was two co-authors of this book. One is Sally Helgesen, who's an international women's leadership expert for many decades, written books. And Forbes magazine called her the world's premier expert on women's leadership. Her co-author was Marshall Goldsmith. He's thought as one of the world's leading executive educator, coaches, and authors. And as Aubrey mentioned, I'm an executive coach, and I'm actually certified in the coaching methodology that Marshall uses with these Fortune 500 executives called stakeholder-centered coaching. So we're going to weave some lessons learned from working with executive clients into this presentation for your benefit. And the story is really interesting how the two of them came together to work on this book, How Women Rise. Is Marshall had a book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And it was an international bestseller. And it talks about the coaching approach that he has and the success he's had with thousands of clients using that methodology. And a mutual friend got Sally and Marshall together and said, you know, I really think you guys should collaborate on a book together after that What Got You Here Won't Get You There came out. And what Sally talked with Marshall was about is that some of the habits that he talked about in his book seem to pertain more to men than to women. And that in her research and her work with women leaders, she found that there were some habits that were more particular to women in general than men that weren't mentioned in his book. And that kind of makes sense because they look back at the data set that Marshall worked with, and 80% of his clients that he worked with as business leaders happened to be men. And so the conclusions he's drawn were from a skewed data sample, is one way of thinking of it. And so Sally helped kind of broaden that data sample and use her own experience. And then that's where they came up with this book. So it's kind of a blending of some of the work that Marshall's done with leaders and the work that Sally's done with women leaders in particular. So that's how this book came about. And I've introduced it to some of my women clients, and they found it very, very helpful. So we hope it'll be helpful to you as well. Sarah Michelle, back to you.
All right, so we're going to kick off our discussion of the habits featured in this book that are identified as holding women back, and also talk through a discussion of how to overcome them. So I'll go through the first 3 habits, and then we'd like to stop for a poll after that so that you can check in with us and see what might resonate with you. The first habit identified in the book is a reluctance that women have to claim their own achievements. The book featured several examples of women who, instead of accepting a compliment or using an opportunity to speak to their own achievement, they instead turn the spotlight onto other people. In a particularly insightful story, a lady was featured in the book who had been interviewed by a newspaper in her local town about some accomplishment that she had made professionally, and she ended up giving all of the credit to a colleague, assuming that a male colleague who had worked with her on this achievement would do the same, and was really surprised when in the paper the next day that wasn't the case at all, and the story was written in a way that seemed like he did all of the work when really it was shared, and she had shown a lot of leadership in that area. So that's something that is a habit that holds women back, and the motivation that women have around that is that people generally tailor their behavior to meet the expectations of their referent group. So basically it means that people act the way the group they identify with expects them to act. So a lot of other women might be more modest, and as a result, typically behaviors that don't meet these expectations might be viewed as disruptive. But in professional situations, you have to think about if women in the 70s, 80s, 90s had been universally concerned with meeting the expectations of their referent group, there wouldn't be any women in management ranks today. So it's important to navigate around this so that you can get to a point where you feel comfortable sharing your accomplishments and giving credit to yourself and as well as others who are deserving of it. The book also discussed a fallacy of thinking in which someone thinks that in order to share their accomplishments, they have to be a shameless self-promoter. But really, that's not the case. You can find something that you're comfortable with, a comfortable way to share your accomplishments without bragging too much. One recommendation that the book has is to enlist in an ally, so that you might ask a colleague to who might have worked with you on a successful project to speak up a bit on your behalf the next time you're in a meeting. So that'll be one step in the right direction. The second habit discussed in the book is about expecting others to just spontaneously notice and reward your contributions. Instead, it recommends that women take responsibility for getting noticed. The women in Sally's workshops who said that they're not good at drawing attention to their achievements usually gave one of 2 reasons for not wanting to call attention to their achievements. So it was either that's not my job, and they think that the work should speak for themselves, or they're worried about being a shameless self-promoter. So the book highlighted that companies don't just make great products and assume that customers should want to buy them. Instead, there's a marketing function that promotes what they do. So you as a professional need to give some thought to that as well. Sally writes about, along with Marshall, about an experience that a woman had in a law firm around this common female strategy of working just as hard as possible and trusting that will get you noticed as a key reason that women in her law firm made partner later in their careers than men. Her journey, as described, indicated that women didn't advocate and identify that they wanted to be promoted as much as men had. And so this thought that a man was ready for promotion was put into their head in a different and earlier way than a woman who was just hoping that her work got noticed. It's recommended that a crystal clear sense of what you're trying to do and why you're motivated to do it not only will enable you to speak your truth powerfully and concisely, but it'll help you to clarify what opportunities you want to embrace and which you should let go of. The third habit discussed in the book is overvaluing expertise. Instead, it's recommended to not just value expertise, but also value building connections that are necessary to take you to your next role. So if you want to rise in your field or in your organization, expertise is only going to take you so far. That's because the top jobs always require managing and leading people who have expertise, not just simply providing the expertise yourself. So just trying to master every detail of your job in order to become an expert is a great strategy for simply keeping the job you have, but not advancing towards the next job that you want. So now that we've gone over the first 3 habits that hold women back, we can take a pause, and Aubrey has a poll for you.
Great, thank you. So at this point, I have just launched a poll. We just want to get an idea of what of these 3 habits do you associate with the most? And you can pick more than one, so you can select multiple. We just kind of want to see where the audience is with how they identify. So I'll give this just a couple of seconds here in order to gather the votes and to think a little bit about your personal self before we share with everybody.
And Aubrey, while they're doing that, perhaps you could share about your experience with habit number 2.
Sure. So Michael, before we started the webinar, was asking me how I identified with some of these habits, and I definitely associate or align with expecting others to notice and reward my contributions. I'm not somebody who wants to self-promote, but rather I want the recognition of other people. And even when I get the recognition of other people, it sometimes makes me feel uncomfortable, but I also recognize that if I don't get the recognition at all, it makes me feel like I question my own ability or skill and things like that. So I definitely align the most with the second habit. We'll go ahead and close the poll now. So we'll share these results with everybody. So you'll see that about 63% of you have a reluctance to claim your achievements. 58% also identify with expecting others to notice and reward your contributions. So I'm glad I'm not alone on this webinar. And then 21% of you feel that you identify with overvaluing expertise. So we have a really good mix here with the first batch of habits.
Thank you very much, Aubrey, and thanks for sharing of your personal experience as well. So let's move to our next slide here. And here's 3 more habits that we wanted to share with you and some thoughts about how to maybe choose a different path. So the number 4 here is building rather than leveraging relationships. So as you can see, it's kind of maybe related to some of the things that came before. So sometimes people might just focus on the building expertise and not also looking at the importance of connections, as Sarah and Michelle spoke about. And we also might be into building relationships. So we might develop relations with people and help others. But when we have certain results we're trying to achieve for our team or a promotion in our career or our career growth, we might be hesitant to then leverage those relationships as I let people know that we'd like help, whether it's telling our boss that we are interested in, growing in the organization and being promoted someday, or looking at allies in the organization saying, hey, can you support me when I put my proposal in at the executive meeting? Like, so it's that might be a reluctance to leverage those relationships. So what we're encouraging is to, if that resonates with you, think about leveraging give and take with good people. We're not suggesting that maybe there's people in your organization that you don't have similar values with, that you're not interested in building a relationship with. That's not what we're suggesting. But we're suggesting that people in your organization that you naturally have some connection to, or you value their expertise and their work in the company, to develop that relationship, and when needed, ask them to help you out so that you can grow and have a greater impact. So that's habit number 4. For habit number 5, we have here failing to enlist allies from day one. So I work with several women executives that have just started some new executive positions, and that's something that we've talked about. Is the tendency might be to say, I have a new position, it's a higher responsibility, and the initial inclination may be that valuing expertise, so I'm going to put my head down, I'm going to learn this job, and I'm just going to focus the first few months on that. Instead, or in addition to that, we're saying also enlist allies, especially if you're in a new company. It'd be good to reach out, to have other touch points with people that can help you learn, that can help you grow, and have allies that you can leverage. So that as you start new positions, or your day one in that new job, work on both. Sure, learn more about your job, but also make sure to have those connections with people that can help you learn faster, that can help you make connections, that can support your efforts. So that's habit number 5. For habit number 6, putting your job before your career, and this is something that was talked about also in the book, had some very good examples where people were, some women were so focused on doing a great job and satisfying the needs of their boss or perhaps other colleagues, that they weren't expressing that they wanted to grow, that they should be considered for other jobs. And so they were just so focused on doing their current job so well that they weren't mentioning to others, whether it was a law firm like Sarah and Michelle talked about, or there's also an example in the book about in the film industry, like saying, hey, I don't want to just be a production assistant anymore. I might want to be the producer of the film. So yes, keep doing your job well, but also put some mental space, free it up to think about growth. And so embrace your potential growth and proactively manage your career. I remember our head of HR and training at the FBI, he used to say, you are responsible for your own career. And I thought that was great advice. At first I was like, wait a minute, you're the head of HR, shouldn't you be responsible for our careers? Like, well, no, who better than yourself to articulate what your growth goals are, where you want to be, and to prepare to achieve your goals. You can enlist allies to help you get there, and you can use HR as a reference point, but we have the responsibility for managing our own careers. All right, so let's pause here and do a poll again. Aubrey?
Great. So we have a second poll up here. Again, same thing, just talking about the last 3 habits that we went over to see how you resonate with those. Again, you can select all 3 if they all apply to you, or you could select more than one. I know I personally tend to identify with building rather than leveraging relationships. especially when I'm thinking about how to get from point A to point B professionally, or I'm looking to make a move or a change. I often don't necessarily think about the people that I already have those connections with or that are already in my network. I tend to think about, at least initially, who should I think about getting in touch with and building on a relationship with, because I also don't want to burden the people that I know. And so that is definitely something I am guilty of. So we'll take just a few more seconds here to get any last minute voters in, and then we will share as we did with the first one.
So Aubrey, while that's happening, let me share a story of leveraging relationships. I was the chief of internal communications globally for the FBI under Bob Mueller when he was the FBI director. And there was a new person who came in in charge of the IT help desk for the FBI. And my team I led was doing communications, and our computers and connections were extremely important for us doing our job. And there was one time when we moved offices and a lot of our computers weren't connected properly, and it was really hampering my team's ability to execute. And this new head of IT, when she came in, I reached out to her because I knew how challenging it could be to be a new unit chief at the FBI and how demanding that was. And so we had gone to lunch. And my initial inclination was just to build that relationship and to try to help her out because I had just been there as a new unit chief myself. But then I faced this really challenging situation, and I went through the standard process of putting in lots of tickets to get my team's computers fixed, but that wasn't going to cut it. The FBI director needed to communicate, and his executive team that we were supporting. So I called her up. I leveraged that relationship, and I said, I understand that you can't give us any special treatment, but is there any way that I can get my team computers fixed faster? And she said, she was quite inclined to try to help me. And she said, didn't want me jumping the line, but she said, if we have very few people that are in the office on Saturday mornings, around 6 a.m. So if you have someone on your team that's there at that time, then I can direct my staff to fix your computers when there isn't the other customers asking for help. And so I did. I got a volunteer from my team. She dedicated her staff, and my team's computers were up and running, and we were able to execute on the mission. So that's an example where I had initially just built a relationship because I was sympathetic to her being new, but then I took the opportunity to leverage it when I really needed that help. So Aubrey, back to you.
Sure, absolutely. That's a great example of that as well. And so we definitely got a lot of people voting on this one, which was great. I'm going to share those results. So we had 61% of you also align with me, which makes me feel good. So it's building rather than leveraging relationships. And then 52% of you equally feel that you identify as failing to enlist allies from day one and putting your job before your career. So it looks like a lot of people on this webinar really tend to identify with all of these habits and a lot, all or at least more than one of these habits. So thank you guys for sharing.
Thank you. And so let's go to the next slide.
So habit number 7 discussed was the perfection trap. So focusing on perfection really sets you up for disappointment because it's unrealistic and also distracts from the big picture orientation that is expected when you reach a senior position. So since you'll never run 100%, it helps to keep in mind that you will never be perfect, either you or the people who work for you. So with this perfection trap, even high-achieving women tend to take failures deeply into heart, to focus on self-blame or to stew over mistakes instead of moving on. This could also hold you back from taking risks, which is a necessary part of senior leadership. Instead, the recommendation is to learn to delegate, prioritize, and to get comfortable taking measured risks. The 8th habit is the disease to please. Maybe you routinely say yes to tasks or jobs that you know will eat up your time, but really not bring a lot of benefit. This disease to please can really undermine your ability to make clear decisions because you're always trying to split the difference amongst competing needs in hopes of creating consensus or to just avoid offending people. This can impair your judgment. It can also rob you of the capacity to act with authority for fear of disappointing others or making them temporarily unhappy. And it makes you an unreliable advocate because you could be very easily swayed in order to not disappoint people. So the recommendation is to not let the disease to please distract you from your purpose, to not let it squander your time and talents, and to not let it hold you back. So instead, it's recommended to think very carefully about priorities. There's not enough time, energy, or resources to do everything, and you need to do what's important very well. The ninth habit is around minimizing. This could be both physical and verbal. Verbal language minimizers persist, such as the use of the word just. For example, I just need a minute of your time. I just want to say something. I just have one observation. And so that really says that what you are saying is not that important. And it sends the wrong message. Another minimizer can be around the habit of using the word we instead of I. So even when describing an accomplishment that's primarily or maybe entirely your own, you might frame it as a we because you want to seem polite and inclusive. But then this could lead to confusion if it's not appropriate because folks might not understand really what you contributed and your achievements. So instead, the recommendation is to hold your space, be fully present, and avoid prologues that diminish your message. It is now time for another poll. Which of these do you relate to?
If I could jump in here, Sarah Michelle, like some of these habits resonate with me. Certainly the perfection trap. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I had to recognize that, well, perfection was part of what led me to get promoted to the supervisory ranks, that once I was a supervisor, I needed to let go of expecting things to always be perfect, or in my definition of perfect, the way I imagined they would be, and then realize that as other people do it their way, it might be better or different than I originally envisioned, but I can't do everything, and then it's only the value of my own brain if I didn't let other people, if I didn't really delegate and let them be the owners of their projects. And also number 9, identify with, sometimes I do that with my coaching clients where I would say, hey, just quick reminder to schedule our next session. And since I read this book, I've been trying to eliminate that minimizing type of language of just a quick reminder or things like that.
All right, so just a few more seconds. I also know that I tend to identify, just as Michael said, with the perfection trap and with delegating. I'd rather do it myself than tend to give people the reins to take on a task and come back to me with what they came up with. I tend to want to hold on to it. And then the minimizing thing, I'm glad that you explained it, because at first glance I didn't quite understand what it was, but I am definitely guilty of doing that, especially using the we language as opposed to an I. And that is something that I need to take better control on in my own personal journey. So thank you guys for sharing that. So we will go ahead now. It looks like 61% of you also fall into the perfection trap. 48% identify with the disease to please, and 70% look to identify with the minimizing habit. So a really good mix there as well.
All right, so I'll tackle this next slide here. This is habits 10, 11, and 12, the last 3 habits that we wanted to talk with you about. So number 10 is too much. And here we wrote that less is more. So when speaking, either in a larger meeting or perhaps with other people, sometimes women might tend to share too much about their, and here too much is a kind of a strange judgment call, but too much about their emotion, or might use more words than are necessary to convey a point, or might disclose more personal information than particularly the men in the room might be used to or comfortable with. So what we're suggesting here is to use that information judiciously and be more conscious of it. So in some settings, having disclosure and sharing your emotion can be great at terms of bonding and developing a relationship, particularly with other women. That type of disclosure and vulnerability helps bring, in general, women closer together. And in general, men tend to not do that and not have as close relationships because they're more hesitant to be vulnerable. So there's a downside to the prevalent behavior that men have in not being vulnerable and sharing this way. Though in a corporation that, at least right now, many corporations tend to be more, have a quote, male dominated culture, these things can hold women back if, when they're presenting, tend to share emotions in an unconscious way. Now there's ways to use it, like if you're concerned about something, or you maybe use some energy that about, I think this is inappropriate or unjust, you can use those emotions in a conscious way to give some weight behind your words. So that's what we're just suggesting, is being more judicious about it if this habit resonates with you. And something like a personal disclosure as a preface, kind of to talk about the habit that came earlier about minimizing. You could say, well, maybe I'm not the best presenter, or maybe I haven't done all my homework, but this is my perspective. That type of minimizing or sharing too much disclosure might negate the impact of what you're going to share. And your male colleagues may not have prepared either, but they still might make their point forcefully, or they might. So I'm just suggesting to be more conscious of these things and see if in particular situations that type of emotion or extra words or disclosure, whether or not that's serving you and helping you get to the results that you like. Habit number 11, ruminating. That's Sally talks about this when she presents with Marshall, about how she learned "oh well" from Marshall. And so she gives an example. It's this really funny example where they both went to a conference together, and it was a women's leadership conference, and they were both presenting. And as Marshall came to town, he's flying all the time, all around the world. They were picked up at the airport, and they were going to the venue, and he told the hosts, "Hey, can we stop by a Walmart? I forgot to pack some pants." And so that was really embarrassing. I mean, I personally would have been very embarrassed to say that, and I've had an occasion where something like that happened to me, and I might ruminate about it. Well, Marshall didn't. He just said, "Oh well, you know, he travels a lot, he's packing a lot, as this thing's bound to happen." He just said, "Okay, let's remedy the situation," before he had to go up on stage instead of wearing, you know, very casual clothes that he had traveled in. Go get some, you know, a little bit nicer clothes. And he just let it go. And Sally then talked about the story how even at that same conference, then he was about to go up on stage and present to this very large audience with her. And he was in a restroom, and the conference had only women's restroom because it was a women's conference. And Marshall had gone into the restroom, and he was at the toilet. And he got up suddenly, and he wasn't used to there being purse hangers on the inside of the door of the stalls, and he accidentally hit his head on the purse hanger and he got a cut on his forehead and was bleeding. So just before he was going up on stage, he was bleeding because of a knock-in with a purse hanger, and he had to kind of wipe away the blood. And he just said, oh, well, these things happen. He wasn't used to the particulars of the functionalities of a women's restroom. And, he went up out on stage and I think just acknowledged that. So it turned out that the audience loved Marshall because he was so sharing and moved on from these things. And you would just say things like, oh, well. And Sally learned that, and she put next to her computer, I think it was in her office, she put up the words, oh, well, to learn from Marshall's example. Whenever she made a mistake, just moving on, acknowledging it, moving on, fixing it, and letting go of it. So that's habit number 11. Habit 12 is letting your radar distract you. So in the book, they make the point that evolutionarily, women and men have had different roles where, back in history, women might be doing things in the camp or for the clan and having multiple things focusing their attention, maybe preparing meals or doing other things for the village at the same time of watching children historically and things like that. So they might evolutionarily have derived a greater radar in general than men. And so that can be very beneficial in many ways. It can also sometimes, in certain circumstances, distract from the bigger picture. So for instance, if like a woman executive at the FBI was presenting in front of a large audience, she might be very aware of all the different people in the audience and how they're reacting to what she is presenting. And there might be someone there that's had a really bad day and might be, a senior executive agent might be sitting up front with his arms crossed, and maybe he's focused on the counterterrorism threat that he just got over his BlackBerry, and so he's worried about that and might be frowning. It might have nothing to do with the presentation of the executive in the front, but she might be hyper conscious of his facial expressions and things like that. So the idea is use the radar when it serves you and not let it distract you when it's not serving you, so you can focus like a laser and get what matters done. So those are the last 3 habits that we want to share with you, and let's go back to Aubrey.
Great, and so we have one final poll here about identifying with any of these 3 habits. So I know that I tend to identify the most with too much, whether it's just oversharing or overcompensating, things like that. That's something I'm definitely guilty of, both personally and professionally. I definitely need to remember that less is more, both verbally and non-verbally. So we'll take just a few more seconds here to gather the final poll results, and then we'll share them. All right. It looks like about 18% of you also identify as too much. 59% associate the most with ruminating, and then 24% with letting your radar distract you. Michael and Sarah Michelle, back to you.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. Go to the next slide here. All right, so Sarah Michelle and I are going to split up the presentation of this slide, and what we wanted to talk about here is some strategies or 4 steps changing for the better. So part of it, we talked about, here's the 12 habits that are generally more likely for women to exhibit than men, and some ways to kind of reframe those habits and practice new ways of approaching things. And here are some ways of how to adopt those new strategies. And start with one thing really resonates with me, because when I work with my clients as supervisors or executives, and they often get a 360 assessment from their team, their peers, and their bosses. And there's often multiple things that the executive could work on. What I suggest is to my clients is, because it's really hard to change our behaviors, and we can get overwhelmed by trying to change multiple things at once. So the general advice I give is to focus on one behavior, or in this case, one habit cluster. So for instance, when we talked about habit 1 and 2, those two generally, if you have habit 1, you probably also do habit 2, and same things with habits 3, 6, and 7, or habits 9 and 10, or habits 11 and 12. So when we suggest focusing on one thing, it could be one practice or one habit cluster, as we're calling it here. So, and it's something that maybe if you say, oh, okay, I've gotten that feedback before, but I don't really want to work on it, that's fine. Pick something that you are motivated to work on, and we'll talk about next the process of how you might work on it. Sarah Michelle?
So it's recommended when you're changing your habits to don't go it alone. You can enlist help, listen to other folks, thank them, follow up with them as you continue on your journey, and also advertise. Advertise is speaking to just sharing what your goals are around this with friends and colleagues so that they can maybe help you on your journey, or maybe change how they might see you professionally.
Great. And so the third step that we wanted to mention was to let go of judgment. And so one way to make it easier when you're going through that process of asking for feedback, listening to what people have to say, and then not arguing with them or feeling bad about it, just thanking them for their feedback, following up, as Sarah Michelle said, and advertising. What might help with that is when you frame the feedback is you do something that Marshall kind of coined as feed forward. Instead of asking people, what did I screw up in the past, say, what suggestions do you have for me for doing something different in the future? So we call that feed forward. So not the past we can't change, so it's hard to hear about things in the past because we can't do anything about it. The past is the past. And so instead we say, what can I change in the future? So it's future focused. It's easy for us as leaders then to accept that input and act on it. And then also if you see things, well, gosh, maybe I should have done this before. If I had done this earlier in my career, I'd be CEO by now. Well, just let go of all that. Let go of that judgment. Just say, oh, well, right? That Sally learned from her experience with Marshall hitting his head on the purse hanger. Just saying, oh, well, that's where we are now. And just be the future focused. And then we have this other phrase here, the to don't list. Often we can make lists of more things to do. And so what we've couched this presentation in is habits to stop, things that you don't want to do anymore. So it takes less time to stop something than it does to do something new. So think of it, I'm gonna stop minimizing. I'm gonna stop focusing on everyone else and not sending any attention to myself and my own career. So you can have a to don't list of things that you don't want to do anymore. And then as you change, you might be hyper aware of these habits. You might see them in friends of yours or colleagues at work. And so try not to be judging of others or judging of yourself. If you say you're practicing a new habit and you fall into some old habits or patterns of behavior, don't be judgmental of yourself. Try to let that go and just say, hey, that's part of a learning process. For myself, I like to call that I'm on the path to mastery, right? I'm going in the general right direction. I might have to sidestep a few times. I might take a step back, but generally I'm headed in a new trajectory on the path to mastery. Sarah Michelle?
So the last step to change for the better is to remember what got you here. So you want to maintain your values while also stopping limiting habits. This is important to continue to keep your strengths and to understand what has helped you to be successful while at the same time pivoting to let go of the habits that are no longer serving you.
Right, and we're really excited because I've seen some of my clients, when they start practicing these new habits, they really start being more successful. It allows them, if they move away from the perfection trap, it allows them to delegate more, as we've talked about. Then they have a greater work-life balance. They're able to focus on more executive skills and build to the next level. They're able to spend more time with their family, like, to address other values that they might have. And so we're excited that as you embrace these things, that allow you to arise and have an even greater positive impact on your world.
Something worth noting here is also Marshall's feedback to all of his coaching clients, and it's really a rule. But he requires the people who he coaches not be too hard on themselves.
Yeah, that's really important. Like, that if we have some, not, you know, that's not going to, like, we flip a switch, or not the technology that Sarah, Michelle, and I have worked on, that's on and off with habits. It'll take some time to learn new things, and if you get feedback, just say, oh great, that's another data point that I can use for my growth. So at this section of the presentation, we wanted to pause and to see, you can write, and Aubrey will guide you how to do that, any questions that you have, and if you also have some commitments you'd like to make, to share those statements with us of what you're committing to try new as you go forward. We'd love to hear that from you. Aubrey?
Great, thank you. So as Michael mentioned, we are taking some questions right now. If you do have a question, make sure to type it in the question box. It's located on your control panel. For older women who have had these habits ingrained for a long time, is there anything additional that they should work on to get the changes to stick?
Well, I like to think about it as that every day is a new day, and we can look at something as build it up as it's hard to change, or we can say that the script that has been written for us, or that we allowed to write for ourselves, that we can change that script and take control of the narrative. So just as Sarah Michelle said in the previous answer, the previous question, like, other people might write a narrative for us, like maybe our family members said we tend to be one way or tend to be another way. We might start to believe that, or other people might have some jealousy and try to create a false narrative to take you down or to keep you in your place. And what we're encouraging you is to turn a new page, to rise above that and write your own narrative.
Thank you. As a young woman minority first breaking into her industry, she's having trouble finding herself and being confident. Any tips for that?
Well, if I could jump in, like, one thing is find some allies, right? So in the workplace, there could be other women, other sometimes an affinity group, like other people in that minority group that you can join with. I found in my personal career, having mentors or sponsors, there's a slight difference between those two things. That's been very valuable in my career, and I often talk with my clients, if they don't have mentors already, to reach out to find mentors that can support them.
Great. And as someone gets on the path to mastery, she would like to understand, as a manager of staff, how you balance giving credit to the team but taking the majority of credit without looking bad.
Sarah Michelle, do you want to weigh in on that?
Actually, Michael, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as a leadership coach.
Okay. Well, as we said in the presentation, it was kind of, if it was a joint effort, you can give praise to the team, and also talk about, you know, it's my pleasure to lead the team. So if I had one client where in like an executive meeting, he would often just defer to someone else to present from his team that was the subject matter expert and not comment at all. And one way to do it is if your team's referenced, you start off and you say, yes, our team's on top of this. We're really happy to provide this service to the company that's having a positive impact on the bottom line. And now I'd like to call upon Sam or Susan on our team to share some of the details, right? So you're framing it, you're showing that you're the leader of the team, you know who on your team is expert, and you're highlighting their contributions. So it's not abdicating responsibility in your role as a leader, but reinforcing it and recognizing your people.
Great, thank you. We had a question about if the presentation is being recorded and sent. The answer is yes. We are recording the presentation. That and the slides will be available and sent to attendees from today's webinar. So that will be coming as a follow-up email, so stay tuned for that. I know we're coming to the top of the hour at this point. Want to just take a minute for any additional last-minute thoughts or questions from attendees or from our organizers and hosts today.
I just want to encourage the people who have joined us. Thank you for joining us, and that's a great first step in learning some new habits and rising in your career. So we acknowledge that your participation here evidences your desire to do that. And we hope that going forward, you'll make a commitment to work on some of the things and have that greater impact that you can. And on this next slide, we wanted to offer that we're available to continue the conversation with you. We welcome you reaching out to us. I have my telephone number and my company's email address, and also a website where additional resources are, and we'll post this presentation. And Sarah Michelle has also put on this slide her LinkedIn address, so there's ways you can keep in contact with us and keep the conversation going.
Wonderful, thank you. And I wanted to just thank Michael and Sarah Michelle today for empowering those that are on the webinar about breaking these habits that are holding women back. I think it's a very important topic. I also would just want to reiterate that I also think it's important to support one another. And so I would encourage everybody to continue to do that. And so I will be sending out a follow-up email today for the recording and for the slides, but I wanted to just take a moment to thank Sarah Michelle, to thank Michael, and to thank all of you for joining us today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and go Terps. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us, and thank you to everyone who participated.
Thank you.